Good evening, everybody. Good evening, good evening. Please take your seats. Thank you. Yes, thanks. Thank you to my fan club. Yes, we're all very happy to have you here. My name is Gideon Lichfield. I work at a thing that has been printed in the program as Quartz magazine. I just want to set some things straight. Quartz is not a magazine. It's a website and an app and various other things. It's all digital. But we were founded 5 years ago, belonging to the Atlantic magazine in the US, as we said it, to try to be the Economist for the 21st century, which naturally we said because I came from the Economist. And as I like to tell people, I think we ended up somewhere between the Economist and BuzzFeed. Anyway, so the Economist is in no danger, I'm glad to say. My colleagues here are feeling very relaxed about my being here, I think. And we are here, obviously, to talk about populism. And the nice thing about this conference is that nobody needs to define the terms of the debate. We all know what we're talking about. Yeah. And so I'm really just going to launch into asking our very distinguished panel some questions about where we go from here. Edward Lucas set some of the stage in his remarks this afternoon when he talked about how do we regain trust? And I think that's central to the question that we're discussing with populism. But I actually want to start with a slight provocation. Does anyone here think that the threat of populism, as we generally understand it, is overplayed, or even that maybe a little bit of populism is a healthy thing? Yes, okay. Maybe. All right, well, I'll be interested to come back to some of those opinions later on when we have the discussion with the audience, because I'd like to address that question a little bit. But let's start with, I think, the most obvious question for me, which is, again, Edward talked about how the recent elections in France and the Netherlands suggested that we are not being overcome by a tidal wave of populism. I'd put it slightly less optimistically. I would say that we have beaten it back for the time being, but that the threat of its returning is very, very present, especially in France, I think, if Macron does not manage to form a very effective coalition in government. The risk of disappointment is high, and the risk of populism returning renewed with strength is high. But we've bought some time. And so the question that I want each of the panelists maybe to start with is, what has to happen with this time that we've bought? What do the people who are positioning themselves as the opposition or the antidote to populism need to do? Carl Bildt, do you want to start?
Well, I'll have to, I guess. But first, I mean, let me say that I'm slightly uncomfortable with this discussion about populism. What is populism? There's always been, if you say that populism is the popular definition of it, is some sort of thin ideology that is the people versus the elites. Well, I've been in politics for a long time. I've done X numbers of election campaigns. To a certain extent, when you're in opposition, you always campaign against elites that are in the capitals and see things have to be better, you've been betrayed to some extent, and we can offer you something better. So an element of that is all over democratic politics. What we are discussing now is, of course, when it goes overboard completely and dominates over something else. But I'm sort of, as I said, I'm hesitant to discuss in terms of populism or not populism, but I'm more comfortable discussing what ideas do they represent. There have been populism of the left, there have been populism of the right, there have been populism of the left and right confused, and there have been sort of general populism. And I think one of the problems that we have is that there's a risk of us going into the battle against populism as such. Yeah. In which case we are seen as the elite fighting the people if things go wrongly. Yeah. We should fight for the ideas that we represent and that they oppose. And there I think the trend, unfortunately, in our respective societies for the last decade or perhaps two, has been that we have lost some of the ideological spirit that we used to have in the past. I'm going to say something that is slightly controversial in Estonia, but I think I grew up in politics when we were fighting things like socialism and communism. You remember those things. And these were fierce ideological battles. And at the end of the day, we won them. and they had the advantage of sort of mobilizing the ideological
And we finished with
energy
Cameron. Was that a
of
big deal?
generations. Since then, I would say that we've become somewhat too technocratic. And the ideological fight for open societies and open world and open Europe has sometimes been lost in a battle for who's the best technocratic manager of our respective countries.
Because that ideology was presumed to be the consensus.
Because the ideology was supposed to be the consensus. And that has opened the way for those that can capitalize on not primarily the economic insecurity. That's a popular thing to say today, the globalization and blah, blah, blah. I think that is not the relevant thing. But the cultural insecurity that is there in our society, and being able to create some sort of wave, and we've not been sufficiently ideologically clear in fighting those particular forces due to the, let's call it ideological demobilization that has happened in the Western societies during the past 10, 15 years.
Okay, Phillip Blond, do you think that, does that resonate with you? Is this a battle about ideology, or is it a battle of styles?
It is a battle of ideology, and unfortunately, I think it's a battle that those who are in the conventional centre don't really understand the terms of. Let me make a few points that I believe to be true, not that I support them, but I think they're quite possibly, well, they're empirically true, and I think they could become truer. I think it's quite possible that we're in a post-democratic age. If you look at any of the various indices or indexes, it's clear democracy is in retreat, from what happened in Russia to what's happened recently in Turkey with Erdogan. And what we're seeing, I think, is a general fraying of democracy and its replacement by what I would call popular authoritarianism. And democracy is failing because the ideologies that were constructed to support it and the means by which it's delivered are also failing. We've created an economic, social, and cultural mix through the types of liberalism that we followed that only serves a minority of people. Liberal cosmopolitans probably constitute something like 99.9% of people in this audience. They also constitute probably a similar percentage of the governing class across Europe. Almost everybody who's in power, who's highly educated, is an economic or social liberal. But if you actually do value surveys, and I do a lot of value surveys, you see that liberal cosmopolitans are in many ways some of the smallest groups in our society. Depending where you do it, roughly, in the most socially democratic areas, it's about 25%. Somewhere like Britain, it's about 15%. They are a minority across the developed world, yet they dominate the developed world. They're in overall control. And the left predominantly argues for social liberalism. So it's very uncomfortable with religion, it's very uncomfortable with family, it's very uncomfortable with anything except social autonomy. By the same token, the right has largely been comfortable with nothing except economic liberalism and the advocacy of such. And what we've really had, I think, at the end of history, is a confluence now between the liberal left and the liberal right. And we've created a world in which people like in this conference room do really rather well. We are able to trade across borders, our skills are in demand, and life is really quite good for us. But actually, I'm particularly struck by the work of Branko Milanovic, which is his famous elephant graph, which I'm sure you all know. And basically what he showed in this, and he did global growth by income decile, is essentially the 20 years from, well, not quite 20 years, but from 1998 onwards, we have seen essentially global growth serve the very, very poor in the third world and the ultra, ultra rich in the developed world. But we've seen working class and middle class incomes stagnate or fall over the last 20 years. And depending quite where you are on the socio-economic group, economic liberalism has not helped you. What it's actually done is diminished your, the return on your labor, and it has made you dramatically insecure. If you do something similar with assets, and I always think assets are the real guide to wealth rather than income, it's even more stark. What economic liberalism has done for those who don't do well has made the cost of not doing well even worse, even higher penalties. And so that's one factor I would want to put you, that liberalism, as we conceive and practice it, serves a minority and only a minority. Secondly, what is really interesting, what I would argue, I do a lot of values-based work and values-based polling, and I believe values are the first front, really. If you actually look at values polarization, that is the guide, in my view, to why populism isn't defeated, why the grounds for populism are there. Pew, for instance, Pew Research have shown that Americans have never been so polarized since they started polling. The Atlantic recently just did a survey, I saw it today, 48% of working class white Americans feel a stranger in their own country. Now, I know everybody's thrilled with Macron, you know, but it's not clear that the grounds for being thrilled are really there. Le Pen increased her vote, as did the far right in the Netherlands. UKIP won. What Trump did, particularly in the Rust Belt, is he essentially spoke to this feeling, and we've now had essentially populist votes that have succeeded in both America and the United Kingdom, and they're quite important for Europe, both of those countries. And and actually, if you look, and I've been reading quite a lot on Brexit, what's really interesting about Brexit is the people who voted for Brexit voted more out of cultural reasons than economic. For them, the cultural rationale for voting for Brexit was more important, and they'd vote for it even if it's against their economic interests. Why? Because they felt under threat from mass migration that was huge and unprecedented. Britain has always been a low immigration country, less than 100,000 from the 70s. And when we hit the 90s, we had 600,000. The great unspoken thing that nobody speaks about, but I think it's imperative to speak about it, is what people perceive as value threats. Remember I said values are key? Islam is seen as a value threat that nobody in the elite speaks to. And I think it's imperative we recognize it as such. And so we're living in a world that I think is post-democratic, where all of the forces that are behind our fracture are growing, they're not receding, where actually the ideology that most of you have is failing and you don't recognize it, so you can't reform it, and where the consequences of that failure are only spreading. So it seems to me to be very weird, a very weird response to be sanguine in the face of such things. And since I'm not in favor of what the populists argue for, I think it's imperative that we create and recognize that Europe, if it is to succeed, can't be governed by liberal cosmopolitans alone, can't be governed by a class that looks after only itself and repudiates all other value sets. And unless and until we in the West reinvent a new foundational values project that unites us all, I really can't see us surviving in the way in which we currently are. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Constanze, maybe this is where you'll be going anyway, but I want to take this discussion into a little bit this almost the tension between whether this is a discussion about ideas or about values, or it's probably both, but how do we reconcile the two? Carl talked about the importance of, essentially you were saying, I think, that we lost our ideological vigor, and that suggested to me that you were talking about a battle of ideas.
Or just a manhood problem.
I'm sorry?
Or just a manhood problem.
A manhood problem. Okay, well, go on. What do you mean by that?
These
Anyway,
feminists.
I have to say, at the risk of being rude, listening to you, Philip, it did strike me that it sounded to me as though you were talking more about England than about Europe. And I think that there are a lot of other Europeans.
All the facts and all the polling said otherwise, but you carry on as you are. You know.
Oh dear. Well, how about giving me some airtime to discuss?
I was just responding, but disagreeing.
All right. I think that in continental Europe, at any rate, and I also think in Northern Europe, there are a lot of political economies that set great store by what I would call, and I say this despite the apparent demise of the Social Democratic Party family in Europe, we do still set by social democracy as an organizing principle of our political economies. And by which I mean functioning political institutions and processes, functioning inclusive markets, and functioning inclusive and fair social contracts. And I honestly don't recognize the picture that you're drawing. I live in Washington now and have for the last 2.5 years, but I travel to Europe a lot and I travel around Europe. And my sense is that people of our kind, and I recognize that we are a tribe sitting here, are deeply concerned, have indeed recognized that they have had blind spots. And I think there is actually great agreement that there is no cause to be complacent about either the Dutch results or the French results, or what appears to be a hewing to the mean by the Germans in polls and in regional elections. None of that is cause for any of us to ignore the profound structural, if you will, tectonic plate shifts taking place in the politics of Western democracies. But I would not go so far, and that's where you and I part company, to say that we live in a post-democratic age. I do still think that liberal democracy, by which I mean limited plural democracy, with separation and balance of powers, is the best possible system that we can have, and that we ought to fight to defend it, and I believe that is what all of us are thinking very hard about currently.
Robert, do you want to pour?
Well,
Do you want to pour oil on these troubled waters? You're
no.
being a former diplomat.
No, I don't. No, I'm a former diplomat, so I can say what I like now. I think that populism is a symptom, in a way, not a problem. I think the problem is something else, probably several other things. But if you ask me what the problem is, I think the problem is actually democratic decay. I'm speaking primarily here about the UK. I think the UK is really a very undemocratic country, and there are lots of people who have got no way of expressing their voice.
Because of the structure of the electoral system, or what?
Yeah, I think that's one big problem. 12 point something or other % of the electorate voted for UKIP, and they actually got one member of parliament, but he was a conservative who switched parties and had a local constituency. Roughly the same number of people voted for the Scottish National Party, and they took every seat in Scotland. They've got, whatever it is, 52 seats or something like that. So I actually think that democracy needs continually to be renewed, and it needs to change as society changes. And in Britain, at any rate, it's been a long time since it's changed. And in America, too, I think that there are lots of ways in which American democracy is corrupted. So for me, for me, it's not a problem of ideology. No doubt there are values questions, but actually, I think at the bottom of this, there are questions about how the democratic institutions function. Certainly in Britain. I can't really speak so well for other countries, but I think America's a problem too.
So is that not agreeing with what Phillip says about it being a post-democratic age?
I think that we risk being a post-democratic age unless we keep our democracy up with society. Society's changed profoundly in the last 50 years. In Britain, at any rate, democratic system hasn't changed.
Constanze and then Phillip. I'll
Just
come back to you
very
then, Carl.
briefly, since I'm the one on this panel currently living in America, there are, I entirely agree with Robert that we really do need to look at structural changes in our democracies. And in America, I would say that there are some distinctive structural changes that are unique to the American political space that have served to deepen the political polarization, and the exclusion of those who see themselves, whether legitimately or not, is another question. Some of them have very real grievances. I'm not denying those at all, but some of them strike me as slightly more imaginary. And one of those is gerrymandering.
Yeah.
The creation of voting, zoning, as it were, for votes that permanently excludes some and privileges others. Then money as free speech, the famous Supreme Court Citizens United decision. And I would say very short congressional terms, coupled with candidates, incumbents being forced to spend 80% of their waking hours doing fundraising for their next campaign, et cetera, et cetera. These are all relatively recent shifts within the last decade or so in American politics that have contributed to a polarization, to a deepening of the divides, and that I think, and if you add to that the economic circumstances that Phillip has described, then I think you come at a situation where I would say the pendulum has swung far out and is not swimming back. And one of the, I think, most distinctive differences, because this ties back into what I'd said earlier, between the American polity and ours in Europe, is that the state as a provider of public goods has been delegitimized in America since the 1980s, since the Reagan Revolution, and privileging markets and society, burdening markets and civil society with the task of providing fairness and public goods. And I think we can see that to some degree has failed and is contributing to this sense of alienation and this sense of disenfranchisement among many American voters who ultimately voted for Trump.
Can I add
Briefly, because I want to bring
I wanted to add
Phillip
another
and Carl
point,
in.
and that is that if you ask people why they distrust the political class, they'll probably tell you, well, they're all out for themselves, I think is a common response. Actually, but what we've done is not necessarily in every country, but we've created a system in which it is so difficult and so awful to get yourself to be elected that only people who are ruthlessly self-interested and ambitious will do it.
Right. Phillip.
Yeah.
So, of course, they're out for themselves.
The first point I want to make is, and I made it at the outset, is just because I'm describing things doesn't mean I'm in favour of them.
I think that's taken for granted.
Well, I'm not so sure. The point is all this stuff about let's get more democratic is, I'm afraid, beside the point. The British had a vote on introducing proportional representation, the famous AV vote, and they rejected it completely. They didn't want it at all.
And the Daily Mail published...
It's not to do with the Daily Mail.
It is.
It really isn't. It's to do with the fact that the British identified the proportional system as leading to weak governance. Let me give you more examples. One couldn't think of a more proportional system than the Dutch one. They even have a party for people who look after animals. Think also of Austria. Austria's had an acutely proportional system that's resulted in a grand coalition that means whoever you vote for, they always get, the opposite side always gets in, hence the support for the far right. So the point is this focus on methodology is nonsense. There's no empirical evidence out there that perfecting democracy in some way speaks to any of these concerns. The concerns are more profound and are more serious. Let me restate them. That democracy, and I believe in the social market economy, I believe in Utkin and Rupke, who I read and I've been attempting in the United Kingdom, with some success, I might add. under the banner of what I call red Toryism, to reinvent it in a British idiomatic. But the point is democracy, I would argue, is failing. It is failing to control oligarchy. It's failing to control monopoly. I'm an ordo-liberal, for those technical market economists of you. I believe that markets should also have as their aim not just consumer welfare, but plurality of ownership. That has gone by the by, and we now have what are called competitive markets, where you have two massive monopolies fighting each other for something spurious called consumer welfare. What this has resulted in is essentially, one might almost argue, a refeudalisation of the economy, where we're creating a rentier economy where the commanding heights are owned by very, very few people, and everybody else is converted to some sort of tenant. And wages no longer will allow the tenant to purchase their own property. That is one aspect of why democracy is failing economically. We are not distributing the returns from growth equitably. The social market economy has failed, and it's converted into an oligarch's model. Now, that's just economics. I haven't even talked about culture, and I haven't talked about identity. And another problem with the liberal project is liberalism at base, and I'm not anti-liberal. I think liberalism is fine as a third-order philosophy, but it's really dangerous as a first-order philosophy, because as a first-order philosophy, it only believes in autonomy. And if you only believe in autonomy, you cannot form collective or shared values. And it's interesting that the societies in Europe that still have the economy you quite rightly talk about are the ones that have the least amount of value polarization or the most amount of trust. And what is remarkable and what is frightening about our societies is as we enter values polarization, become less trusting, that is the fundamental deep break that democracy, whether we have it in this system or that system, can't speak to. What we face in the West is an ideological threat that we're not realizing. We have to reform Western values outside of their narrow capture by liberal cosmopolitans in a way that captures all of our people. And if we don't do that, I'm afraid the divisions in our societies will only widen.
Okay, thank you. Carl Bildt, you've been showing great forbearance, please.
Yes, I have, because there's quite a lot of... Phillip is a nice guy. But there's quite a lot of things that you've said that I profoundly disagree with. Okay. I have to confess. And you said in the beginning, I'm not quite certain whether you agree with it or not, you said, and I quoted, liberalism has served only a minority.
The current form. Yeah.
No, yeah, whatever form. I think that is profoundly wrong. And the fact that we've not been able to stand up and say that is wrong is one of the fallacies of our age. I've been around for some time. I was born in a world where we had 2.5 billion people. And I went to university and I read all the books that you were supposed to read at that particular time. I learned that things were going to go to hell. You had to read Lenin and others who said that the third world was going to get poorer and poorer, and there was going to be the concentration of capital and everything was going to explode. Well, today we are 7.5 billion people. And it's not that the majority of them get poorer and poorer. The majority of them get better and better. We are on the verge of getting rid of poverty in the world. Extreme poverty is down to less than 10% of the world population. The liberal global order has delivered, I would say, the best quarter of a century for mankind in known history. You can disagree about different aspects of it, but the broad picture is this one. And that applies to global scale, no question about it. It applies to our countries as well. The President, I think I got the figures right. You said that since the former new members entered the EU, which is not that long ago, a decade and a couple of years, 1.9 times more prosperous. And that applies to more or less everyone. So I would say the liberal global order and the liberal order of our societies have served the majority of our peoples much better than anyone could ever have dreamt of. Then you might argue that there's a minority that is feeling somewhat left behind. That is true. Not probably, that is true. And that is the question, have we been successful in integrating this minority? That is always there, by the way. Profound social change doesn't happen in a uniform way. Some are faster and some are slower, and technological progress and change and whatever. Have we been successful in integrating these minorities? No, we haven't. That's the problem. And that, I think, has to do with what I sometimes call the decline of the great narratives in our historical spaces. The big narratives forming the future, be that communism or socialism or liberals, that has been declining. And we've seen a fracturization of the political and ideological landscape, and we have the greens and the browns and the reds and the blues and whatever. The kaleidoscope of politics in Western Europe, that has also created less of a possibility for integrating these minorities. And then we have the, I would say, the angry quarter of our electorate, because we do have an angry quarter of our electorate. We probably always had it, by the way, because if you look at the pace of structural change of our economies, it wasn't less in the 1950s. I would even argue it was more in the 1950s and 60s, at least in our part of the world. But we are better at integrating it. We have been less good at integrating it. And that has to do with, to a certain extent, what I call the ideological demobilization, the fracturing of our political landscapes that we've seen. But I would argue that one of the problems that we have at the moment, there are many, is the reluctance of the liberals to stand up to what has been the enormous success of the liberal global order. I confess to being a militant globalist. Because I think this particular ideology has brought more good to the world than any other ideology that we've seen for a very long time. But we've been, in our technocratic belief during the last decade or so, in our ideological demobilization, we've not been sufficiently good at standing up to the values and interests. And that has, to some extent, contributed to the present situation, to some extent.
Well, I have a follow-up to this, but if you want to intervene quickly.
Carl is also a nice guy, and
glad you think so.
No, and I enjoy very much this discussion. I remember we had it. Carl and I were on a panel at GlobeSec 2 years ago, and Carl said more or less exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
And I said, I think, yeah.
And who won?
And I said, I think Trump will win, and Britain will vote for Brexit. Yeah. And you were there. And the audience laughed. And I rest my case. I mean, the point is this is too sanguine. And there isn't the empirical evidence for what Carl says. Now, it's true, globally, liberalism, though it's hard to call the Chinese liberal, if we really want to talk about who's lifted, what has lifted the Chinese out of poverty. But it's certainly true, globalization has massively helped the third world. Absolutely. Again, I refer to Branko Milanovic's graph. But what I think is the weakness in Carl's position is he can't explain what's going on today. He can't explain why, if liberalism is so great, if it's so wonderful, we have all these people out here who are unhappy with it. And because he can't explain it, we risk just casting them as racist, as stupid, as ignorant. But actually, again, if you look at the empirical evidence, it's very clear, for instance, that it's not a minority who've had stagnating incomes. Depending on which country, it can be over 50%. And if you look at what people could expect from their lives, say, for instance, in the 70s, in my country, a working class wage would buy you a house, would buy you stability, would ensure also a comfortable pension in later life. None of this is now true. And if you also look at the rise of who's got the proceeds of growth. Now, part of my project is to reinvent, the Rhineland model or the social market model. So I'm not arguing from some atavistic point of view. But what worries me is many of the people I argue with don't want to face how the facts are for people who are different from themselves. I'm sorry, both the polling evidence and the empirical evidence is with me. There are substantial numbers of people, no longer minorities, who are not benefiting economically, who also feel culturally and are socially in terms of state expenditure, made deeply insecure. And that's the world we're in. And I believe we need to face reality rather than
Phillip,
reinvent
where
stories.
you're wrong, I think, is in believing you're the only person in this room who worries
Could
about
I just say
this.
that
One second, all right.
we-
Order.
Order.
Thank you.
Order. Liberal order.
Much
liberal
as I-
order, liberal order. Where I think I disagree with you on the economic aspect of it. I think it's not economic insecurity is not what is driving what we see. I could agree with you. It's cultural insecurity. That is a thing we haven't tackled sufficiently well. And I would say, I mean, I'm not going to go to the Brexit debate because you know that far better than Robert knows it far better than I do. But I would say it was far more the cultural insecurity issues than the economic aspect of it. And to some extent, the same applies to Trump. I don't think his greatest argument was that he was going to resurrect coal mining. His greatest argument was that he was going to build a wall.
But the
So it's more the culture than the economic aspect. Sorry.
I don't want to carry on the debate too long about what are the causes, because I want to get a little bit into the question of how we tackle it.
Good.
If that's okay.
Yep.
Robert, you're...
Well, I just wanted to say that the Brexit debate, in the sense of the Brexit referendum, was a demonstration of the failure of the British political system as it is now. Because the British political system that I was brought up in was parliamentary democracy. And going outside that system, it was in a sense a confession of failure by this. It was a confession of failure actually by the Conservative Party. But nevertheless, so I'm not sure who has won my vote between Carl and Phillip, but I still think that whoever wins this argument, it's a good thing to have political institutions that people can identify with.
Well, okay.
And I believe that really is a part of the solution to any problem.
Well, so another part of the solution, and this is also something where I want to bring in Constanze, is about how we communicate things. So some of you probably know of George Lakoff, who is a cognitive scientist in Berkeley. He's talked a lot about the ways in which the metaphors that people use shape their worldview. But he also has an interesting argument, although I don't know if it's backed up by evidence. He claims that in America, the difference between conservative, or between Republican and Democrat, basically political operatives, is if you're a Republican, you're more likely to have studied business, marketing, advertising, that kind of thing. And so you have an understanding of how to communicate to people on an emotional level in terms of their frames and their perceptions. If you are a Democrat, you're more likely to have studied political science, law, or economics, one of those things. You're going to make more reason and fact-based arguments, and therefore you don't know how, in fact, he says you don't know how to appeal to voters. And this is why earlier when we were talking about the battle of ideology, I brought up the question of the battle of style. How much of this is really about ideology, and how much of it is just the communication style, Constanze?
God. You know, I find these categories very hard to grasp. And I admit that maybe it's my lawyer training that makes me sort of tend to gravitate towards questions of architecture and structure. I'd actually like to take this in two different directions, if I may, because style questions strike me as sort of profoundly secondary here. I'd like to pick up on what Robert just said, and I think one of the things that Britain and France today have in common that distinguish them somewhat from other political cultures in Europe is that they're extremely centralized, with very strong, very powerful urban metropolises that are the centers of power, and an enormous divide between these metropolises and the periphery. The rural areas and sort of post-industrial zones. And that decentralization, or the lack of decentralization and real devolution, a real, as it were, horizontal balance of powers and vertical balance of powers in these polities makes for part of the tension that we have seen in Brexit and that we are going to still see in France, certainly. Yeah? The other thing that I want to address that we haven't talked about at all, and that I think is a much more specific concept than identity, is the question of who is a citizen, and when and how do they become a citizen. And one of the issues that we, I think, have failed to grapple with in Europe is how do we make migrants, refugees, and in particular Muslim migrants and refugees, citizens. And one of the things that we don't like talking about is that in the UK and France and Belgium and the Netherlands, we have large communities of people who came to these countries as citizens, but were formerly citizens of colonies and became citizens of these countries in brutal decolonization wars, which very often involved war crimes by the colonizing power. Remember when Macron in the election campaign said that the Algerian war was a war crime, and the hell he got for it. I think that these people, in other words, have become citizens, they've been given passports, and particularly in the very strict French dispensation of secularism, they have been told not to pine for their old culture, not to publicly affiliate or in any way assert their religious identity or their ethnic identity. And as far as I'm concerned, that's adding insult to injury. That is a certain degree of callousness on the part of the former colonial power that I think that we're now all being punished for. And I'm not suggesting that my own country, Germany, is in any way better. We were lucky in losing our colonies in 1919 as a result of World War I. We did, of course, commit one genocide in Southwest Africa, in Namibia. That's well known. But let me give you a similar example and be provocative to some of the Germans in the room. I think that we assumed somewhat callously in 1989 that our new East German fellow citizens would be only too delighted to take on all the elements of Western German cultural identity and political identity, and that they had nothing of their own to bring to the table or to contribute to the new reunified Germany. And I think that attitude on the part of us West Germans, and I'm one of them, created a trend, is responsible for a tremendous amount of alienation. And so all of us, I think, have questions to ask of ourselves, how we have managed these questions of identity and of citizenship. But I like the sort of constitutional notion of citizenship because it comes with rights and with duties. And I find that easier to define than these questions of identity and values.
Right. The question you're raising, though, touches on, so Germany obviously took in 1 million refugees last year. I was in Stockholm for a couple of days. People in Sweden were talking to me about the rise in anti-refugee sentiment there. Is there a limit to a country's capacity
Of absorption.
for absorption, and which countries are in danger of reaching that limit now?
Well, I can't speak for Sweden. In Germany, and some of you have heard me say this before, I think if you'd asked me to guess how this would go in the fall of 2015, I would have said, oh, the German institutions, well-oiled machinery, they'll deal with all this, and German civil society will be up in arms. And oddly, it was just the other way around. The machinery of the state was completely overwhelmed, and civil society, in the most miraculous ways, rolled up its sleeves and went to work. And I have sort of stories from my own friends, and I'm sure there are people in this room who've done similar things. Now, of course, we've also had the opposite. I just want to say that. I don't want anybody to think I'm being Pollyannish here. We've had crime against immigrants, or crime against refugees, and crimes by refugees. And of course, the sense that the state's institutions were struggling, I think, was a significant contributor to the rise of the alternative for Germany. To the extent that the state has been seen to slowly cope, I think that has significantly contributed to the AfD drifting down into the single digits again. Well, that plus Brexit plus Trump, I think. But in other words, I think the larger point that I'm trying to make is that I think people are willing to absorb a great deal as long as they think that the institutions and the resources are there to make it possible, that it's not all left to the citizens, that citizens don't have to be heroes every day in grappling with this, but that they are getting help with this and that there is some kind of an orderly process, and that indeed those who refuse to fit in, I mean, and that's a sort of unpleasant but necessary part of this story, that those who refuse to fit in, who try to undermine it, who try to commit acts of terrorism, will actually be removed and will not be part of this newly configured polity.
Right. Phillip and Carl both want to respond to this, and then I want to open it up. So, Phillip.
I want to respond too.
Just add to what Constanze is saying, which I
Very
agree
short.
with fundamentally. I mean, of course, there's a limit in terms of...
Very short.
Should maybe
Sorry,
introduce
go on, Carl.
the two-finger rule,
Yeah.
if people stick with it.
It's a question, of course, of the time factor. How much can you take in a limited period of time? And there's a question, I mean, no question, there can be a problem there. But if I look at my own country, Sweden in this particular case, we took the very big wave of Balkan refugees in the beginning of the 90s. That was very problematic in those days. And it took quite some time for us to be able to handle this and whatever. And had I, in that particular time, been given the figures of what we would be able to accomplish prior to 2015, when we got the next big wave, I would have been surprised that we could do as much as we did. We did it over time, and we did it gradually. 2015 was a shock to Europe because it went too fast, and we were not prepared for it. And we had the problems, and we still have the problems. Then we do have a problem, I think, in terms of whatever you call integration capacity. Different societies are slightly different. And in the, say, the Nordic welfare societies, we have, one of the problems that we have is in the ins and out problems. We have various structures, we have benefits, we have rules, we have blah, blah, blah, all of this, which means that if you're inside the system, you're well. If you're outside the system, you're outside the system. And the system tends to be somewhat hostile to too many people coming in. Istanbul has more Syrian refugees than the rest of Europe taken together. Have we heard of any major problems there? To some extent, that is because of the fact that Turkish society is somewhat more amorphous. They don't have the strict structures. If I look at Sweden, where we can absorb them over time, it's gone backwards. It used to be that it took 7 years for 50% of the migrants to enter the labor market. 7 years is a frightfully long time. It is now 9 years to take 50% of the labor market. That is not a cultural issue, that's a structural issue of our two structured societies built up in a different age to accommodate for the people that are there, but not being sufficiently open to the people that are entering. And that is going to be, I think, the big challenge for our societies and for the European societies. The other side of that particular coin is, of course, that one of the reasons why Swedish economy has been doing better than most other economies during the past, say, 15 years is migration. With all of the problems, we have an element of dynamism and vitality and expansion in our economy that countries that have been less open don't have. So it's a fairly mixed picture, and there's a lot to learn from it by all of our societies, because this is the challenge of the future.
Phillip and then Robert.
Yeah. I think you have to be a little careful in arguing that for hypergenerosity to new arrivals. Because what happens is you actually, unbeknownst to yourself, you create enormous hostility.
Yeah.
It's a Freerider problem. So a classic example of this is in the United Kingdom, where we used to have what one might call a contributory welfare system. Essentially, what you put in, you got out. So the white working class in Britain's cities would have, the family would be in a council house, and they'd put their names on a waiting list, and then they too, in time, would have a council house. And what you then had is you had whole streets with family relationships and very stable white working class communities. With the first wave of British migration in the 60s, you then changed from a time served on the waiting list system to a needs-based system. And the needs-based system then meant essentially that nobody who had paid into the system who was on the waiting list would ever get a house again. And that needs-based system, that non-contributory system, essentially created decades of white working class hostility to black, as it was, and West Indian and Indian migration, the legacy of which we've probably only just overcome. And this, I think, is the tragedy of our reception systems, that no human society survives, no high trust society survives once there's a perception of a free rider. Once there's a perception of somebody gaining without paying in, everything collapses and collapses very quickly. And so it's imperative, I think, that for new migrants, that we actually set up a contributory time-served system so that they don't, on the basis of need, as it were, jump the queues, because then that creates mass hostility to that welfare system. So in Britain now, if you look at the attitudes of the young, nobody supports the welfare system as it was originally. And that's one of the reasons why the welfare system in the United Kingdom has collapsed in the way in which it has. So it's imperative to start to think about how we create public services and state services that have a contributory element, so don't lead to values polarization. And the second point I'd make that nobody talks about, we need values audits. We run the risk of importing hostile minorities, and unbeknownst to ourselves, we cannot continue to create a society where we assume everybody has the same value set, and we can import these values without any regard to the values we're importing. And it's the failure to kind of what anthropologists would think would self-evident, to actually try to inculcate or create programs for value change, value endorsement for migrants. But we actually import them often with a completely different value set, and then we're surprised at the conflagrations that result. This is what we must these are the difficult questions we need to raise if we're going to start rebuilding trust, particularly in an era of high migration.
Robert?
I wasn't going to talk about changing people's values. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing even.
Depends on the values they have.
I wanted to, well, I don't know. I kind
Nazis?
of believe people ought to be able to think their own thoughts. But anyway, that's a separate issue. I actually wanted to come back to what Constanze said earlier at the beginning about concepts of citizenship, because this bothers me, but that's a local problem because we're such a mess. In the referendum on Scottish independence, the electorate was anybody who was in Scotland on that day. Actually, I don't mind that as a referendum. I don't know whether there was a kind of mass migration to Scotland or not at that particular time. In the Brexit referendum, the electorate was British and Commonwealth citizens. That meant who had been resident for, I'm not quite sure how long it is. That meant that if you'd been there for 6 months or so, and you were a Bangladeshi, you could vote. If you're a British person who'd been 15 years in France, you couldn't. If you're Cypriot, you could vote, because that's okay, because that's Commonwealth. If you were a Lithuanian who'd been there for 10 years, you couldn't vote. So I thought all of that was, kind of pretty muddled, and I quite like the everybody who's there can vote version, or the everybody who's a citizen has rights, but those things need to be thought out rather than just kind of, there needs to be, on these things, if you're going to invent new forms of democracy, you actually need to have a serious debate about them.
Okay, we're running close to the end of our time, but I want to bring in a couple of comments from the audience. We had a hand over there and another one over there.
There is no limit on the time for this.
I'm sorry?
There's no limit on the time.
Oh, there is no limit? I suppose the limit is when enough
end.
people are walking out the door that we can't hear ourselves talk anymore. All right, and I've heard the sound level going up, so.
Thank you, Anders Åslund from the Atlantic Council. I don't understand that we can be surprised of the populism. The problem, to my mind, it's not liberal democracy, but that liberal democracy does not stand for liberal democratic economic policies. We have three big economic problems we are discussing: inequality, Well, taxes are 3 times higher on middle-class incomes than on the really rich, who only pay capital gains tax. What surprise then? Nobody really pushes for equalization on this. The second is low economic growth. Well, we don't deregulate labor markets in the countries that suffer the most and ease this fiscal burden. Many EU countries do very well. Why don't the suffering countries learn from the good policies, for example, in Sweden and the Baltic countries? And the third is unemployment. And many EU countries, Denmark, Britain, Ireland, Germany, have no problems with unemployment. Southern Europe have huge problems. So these are domestic problems, and these are weak politicians who don't pursue liberal, democratic economic policies. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we have, I think, Kostya, did you want to say something? No, all right, so first you, then Kostya. And please try and keep it brief because we're seeing a rate of attrition.
Fine. I'm Mike Halsall, Johns Hopkins. First of all, since you don't have an American on the stage, I feel the need to say that Constanze was fantastic. It's an argument for public policy globalization. She was perfectly right that it does matter. Mechanics do matter. Open primary experiments in the United States have proven that, number one. Number two, I'm really happy she brought up the incredibly important point of naturalization, that is, making citizens. In this age of Donald Trump's Muslim bans, I think I should point out the fact that the United States naturalizes more people every year than the rest of the world combined. That's not a small thing. We peaked at about 1 million a few years ago. We're down to about just short of 800,000. It's an important fact, and it's one of our great strengths. Let me just comment very briefly on Mr. Blond. I think you were very long on diagnosis and very short on cure.
I've got another.
You know, at the end, you covered yourself by saying that we have to include all these people. But let me just say, you mentioned 48% of my fellow white Americans who are alienated or don't understand their country or feel, whatever the term you used, count me in the 52%. But let me just say,
I did.
Yeah, but let me just say that you ignore the role of politicians to lead. It's not just to follow. Okay, people are alienated. You have to ask why. And I would say that if, for better or for worse, half of these 48% are alienated for legitimate, what I would consider legitimate reasons of being left behind by globalization or automation or whatever else, you try to come up with policies to ameliorate their condition. But that percentage, and I regret to say as an American, there is a percentage that is alienated, of the 48% you cited, that's racist. I'll be damned if I'm going to cater to that. If I'm a politician, I'm going to oppose it. That's values, and that's what politicians are supposed to be elected for, not to demagogue the issue and win votes by trying to pit one person against another on the basis of race or class or whatever.
Thank you. Kostya, I got. Behind you.
Behind you.
I'm Constantine from Moscow, and I have to say that Russia's taken in about 25 million people over the last 25 years from Central Asia to the Caucasus, and experienced at first a bit of a problem with that, but I think that now what we see is a marked decrease in anti-immigrant sentiment. And strange enough, I rarely agree on anything with the Kremlin, but the fact that all these people are living in conditions of pretty much wild capitalism, I think contributed a lot to this integration, because they have to go and work. I mean, they don't have time to sit in a council flat and watch ISIS videos on iPhones that they bought with the Russian taxpayers' money. I'm being pretty frank about it. So I wonder, my question is, I'm not saying Russia's a success, believe me not, but it seems that worries of extreme xenophobia and racial or ethnic conflicts somehow were overblown. These predictions were there 10 years ago. My question is to the European participants, we don't have American participants here. I don't know whether the British people count for Europeans anymore. My question is whether in the age when you can't have or you can't proclaim any kind of official national identity, it is sustainable to have a social welfare system of the type that exists, at least on the European continent. Whether it is actually survivable in the age when local populations are declining, there are lots of migrants and they have the right to seek better life, there's no doubt about that. Whether actually it is sustainable if you look in the perspective of 20, 30 years. Whether you can, you have to do something about it in order to equalize via better economic activity. I mean, because otherwise you will always have ghettos. That's my perception.
One more question over here, and then I'll give the panel a chance to respond a little bit. Sorry, over there, and then over here. Over here. Thank you.
I have an observation. Through the ages, we have seen how the public opinion has been hijacked. Demagogues have done it. Nowadays, it's much easier than ever before. You only need to have suitable newspapers or a television channel or something like that, and you hijack the public opinion. And then it becomes a snowball effect, growing and growing, and people join in. And thereby we are blowing up perhaps a relatively small movement because it serves either the commercial interests or the political interests of a few. This is more pronounced today than ever before, and certainly part of the problem as we face it today.
Does any of you want to come back on this question of social welfare and whether or not such a system continues to be possible? Phillip, I somehow knew you would.
Well, you can have whatever degree of social welfare you like if you trust the people. We can have welfare at 98% if that's what the society values. The point is our rates of social welfare are directly connected to our rates of social trust, are directly connected as do we think our fellow citizens are kith and kin. That's what it's connected to. And if we do, we will support, like the Nordic countries, we will support high levels of welfare. If we don't, then support collapses through the floor. So the first question, as always, is a values-based one.
Carl.
No, I think both Constantine and Anders are hinting at roughly the same issues, which is somewhat beyond this debate, but clearly key European issues for the future. The demography, both in terms of declining populations, somewhat more in some countries, somewhat less in some countries, age structure changing fundamentally, and then can we afford what we have? And I think we can, but not without fairly fundamental reform. And that reform includes integrating new people into our economies and societies. That is not doable without changing structures that are too rigid at this present time. That is not possible without profound political leadership on these particular issues. And that, I think, is to some extent lacking. So it's not that it's not doable. I think it's doable. But it's a question, are we doing enough in order to prepare the ground for it? And that is a somewhat more relevant question.
I have one question here and then one at the back.
Can I say something?
Oh, yeah, sorry, Robert.
Because I thought some of the questions, there were some interesting questions. First of all, I think it's Jaco's question I wanted to remark that I wanted to respond to, and that is, in the UK, it seems to me that for quite a long time we've had soft populism alive and well and living in the political parties, especially when they fight elections. And generally speaking, the bad-mouthing of the European Union across the board in the British political class has been a kind of rather stupid populism for which people are now paying the prices. So it's not just the recent surge, it's sort of been there for a long time. And I don't know quite why and what's wrong with us. But the other thing that I wanted to say on the immigration question is, and I bet Phillip has got very good explanation for this. But what's very obvious in Britain is that the places that are most anti-immigrant, seem to be most deeply concerned about it, have never seen an immigrant. The place where you really get the immigrants, there are some exceptions, but one example of a place where you really get a lot of immigrants is London, which has just elected a Muslim mayor and was strongly Remain and is actually a great cosmopolitan success, which unfortunately, and actually this was what Constanze was saying, unfortunately is a kind of unique. It's a city-state really, because it's separate from the rest of Britain, but it's a really good place to live.
Sorry, Constanze. Phillip.
UKIP voted. Just a point. The highest rate of those who voted for Brexit is in Boston, Lincolnshire, which also has one of the highest rates in the country of migrant labour.
Yes.
So it's not quite like that.
Yeah.
Sorry, Constanze, you wanted to respond.
But also in Wales, they voted for Brexit, and they've never seen an immigrant there. And I understand, from the point of view of immigrants, why they wouldn't go too.
Now, I'm still sort of puzzling over this whole sort of values test notion. I would, frankly, I was sort of chuckling earlier because I was thinking that I would quite like to see it applied to the likes of the leadership of the AfD, of Jobbik, to Marine Le Pen, and to UKIP, rather than poor refugees who've just been washed up. But be that as it may, the German Interior Minister, Thomas de Maizière, has just made an attempt to introduce this notion into the German political sphere, of course, as an election maneuver. He revived I thought, deservedly dead idea, which is out of the German Leitkultur, the leading culture to which others who join who want to live in our country must affiliate themselves. And the way that most of you will have read about this, the way he formulated his rules was in a German tabloid, Bildt, and I have to say it was uniquely ham-fisted prose that he chose to do it in. I've always personally preferred this American idea of sort of constitutional values that you affiliate yourselves with, while at the same time being given the right to exercise your religious freedoms, to announce your ethnic and religious affiliation as something that is separate from that, but can exist in the same space, as long as it doesn't in any way undermine your commitment and your obedience to these constitutional values.
But isn't that completely inherent in what America is? In other words,
well,
could you
what I'm
recreate the America
that's worth imitating?
Can you imitate it? Can you take a country that has 1,000 years of national history and try to transpose an American
Germany
value
doesn't
system
have
onto
1,000
it?
years of national
Do we really
history.
want to?
Well, we did for a while, between 33 and 45.
All right, one at a time.
America has one of the highest rates of segregation and ghettoization in the developed Western world, in large part because they don't have a common values project. And if you look at their social outcomes, which are disastrous, from infant mortality to poverty to crime, they can do that to their own people because they don't think they're their own people. And so that's why I think, and I do agree with you, I like your idea of testing Jobbik, testing the extremists. That's
UKIP.
That's
Nigel Farage. Let's test him first.
No, it'd be much better to have them in Parliament.
But here's the point, I agree.
Yeah.
Here's the point. The point is, unless you have a common values project, you are not going to be able to integrate migrants nor stop the extremists in your own nation. Now, I don't believe in this in a horrible 1984 sense. I mean, the difficulty for our societies is those values used to be organic because we lived with relatively small amounts of migration over long periods of time. The question for us is, how do we reform them in a period of such rapid migration and such rapid change? And we need new vehicles to create new models of shared trust. Otherwise, we're in trouble.
Okay, so.
Andrea Larian of Cato Institute. May I ask you to shift a little bit attention to issue of terminology, democracy versus populism. It seems to me that democracy in Greek is almost exactly as populism in Latin. Is there any stylistic difference in English between these two terms? Yeah. Or if, for example, Brits vote against Brexit, it is democracy, but if they would vote for Brexit, it's populism? Or if Americans vote for Hillary, it's democracy. If for Donald, it's populism. If French vote for Macron, it's democracy. And if they would vote for Le Pen, it is a populism. So in other words, if people vote for us, it is democracy. If they vote for our opponents, it's populism.
No.
If it's a little bit more, could you please?
And if I ask a question, is it provocation?
It's a bit more complicated.
If I ask a question, it's provocation, and if Andrei Lovionov asks a question, it's trolling. All right, before we come back to...
Perish the thought.
Sorry?
Perish the thought.
Perish the thought. This gentleman's been waiting a very long time, so please go ahead, and then over here.
Well, I'm Florian, I'm from Germany. I'm not satisfied with the way you discuss this issue. I think actually you failed the question. Why is that?
That's my fault in that case. Go ahead.
This is a good
because, you know, I think what you should have addressed is actually the challenges that came up with Brexit and Trump. And what is that? Mm-hmm. We are here in Estonia, and the former president, Thomas Hendrik Ilves, has made a very nice analysis of what is going on, what is the challenge of digitalization to the democracy. Mm-hmm. And I think that is what you should addressing. And you have been talking for 1.5 hours without mentioning it, without mentioning fake news.
On the contrary.
We have a panel on fake news tomorrow.
The dynamics that fake news spread quicker than the real news because they're more interesting, and also the mechanics of that we have now a manipulation machine which is able to manipulate people on individual basis, and we do not have any legal or democratic rule for these processes, and that's the danger of populism. I mean, populism is as old as democracy, but the technical means that now are at hands of people who have money and the know-how, that is the challenge. And there I would like to have some answers on how to politically kind of get the genie back into the bottle. Because if we do not address that, that is indeed a danger for our Respublica.
I'm going to propose that questions about fake news and technology and all of that are kept for Edward Lucas's panel tomorrow morning. Over here, and then over there, and then over there. Who's got the microphone?
Wow,
yes.
I'm getting confused about the questions now.
Yes, my name is İlter Turan. I'm from Istanbul Bilgi University. This discussion has been interesting in the sense that it has focused mainly on European countries. And in fact, the phenomenon of populism as challenging to democratic institutions is not unique to European societies, but because the focus was on European societies, I think specific questions relating to Europe predominated as the explanatory variables. And in fact, you look at Philippines and you have Duterte. And you look at Venezuela, you have Maduro. And if you look at Malaysia, you have Najib Razak. And I don't want to continue, but I have a feeling we might elevate the level of discussion a little bit more. And actually what we see is the failure of electoral politics to produce acceptable solutions to society. In other words, failure of the democratic process to produce consensus. And what this seems to produce is essentially something we didn't talk very much about, but a leader who tries to personalize and deinstitutionalize politics. And whether it is Duterte or whether it is Mr. Trump, it's the same thing. They don't respect the established institutions of government to implement ordinary politics. So I think the analysis has to be deepened a little bit more, and we have ended up with highly fragmented societies, highly selfish politicians, failure to produce consensus, and then a challenge to democracy. So I just wanted to make this
Okay, I'm going to take two more questions and then bring it back, and then maybe after that we'll wrap up, because I think we've been keeping them a long time. So over here, yes.
Hi, good evening. My name is Baiba Braja. I'm Latvian ambassador to the UK, but what I say is my private opinion, so...
RTs are not endorsements, yes.
So, actually, I think the discussion is very much from the past century, but what we talk about currently is the same political campaigning using different means. So when we look at audiences, channels, means, etc., it's just different. In this case, both the Brexit, Trump campaign, whatever we look at, it's just certain groups have used what we have in terms of technology, and those are more connected private sector groups much better than political elites. So that's what we have to look at. Basically how the established parties, established elites have not been able to catch up with technological developments. That's it. Thanks.
Have not been able to catch up, you said?
Have not been able to catch up. Carl, question to you, why?
Gentleman in the corner over there.
Thank you. Ognan Minchev from Sofia, Bulgaria. I also would like to question the question, can democracy survive populism? It's misguiding. Populism, among other things, means charismatic leadership, which transcends the institutions, the parties and the other institutions, which fail to represent the citizens and directly addresses the citizens in order to get its victory. It means that elites have become self-sufficient, including liberal elites, and the institutions they have created do not represent public opinion anymore. That's the nature of populism. When established democratic institutions fail to be democratic, then democracy comes back as populism. Take a look at the 4 major candidates at the French elections. All of them were populists, not only Madame Le Pen, because all of them were running upon a ticket which is out of the established political parties, their structures, and their main ideologies.
Good, thank you. I want to thank you for bringing us back very neatly to that central question. So maybe I'll ask each of you to finish by summing up how you respond to that. What does have to happen for democracy to survive populism?
Robert,
go ahead.
First of all, I wanted to say that I thought that the last set of questions, we had lots of really interesting points, and there were a couple that I wanted to respond to.
Yes.
One of the questioners said populism is as old as democracy. Actually, I think populism is older than democracy. Populism is the mob. And the idea of democracy was an attempt to involve the people without involving the mob, was to try and find a way of channeling people into a reasoned political debate rather than have them acting as a mob. So I think the question of how you do democracy is very important indeed. The second point that I wanted to make comes to the gentleman here in the middle, with whom I strongly agree. The point of politics, of good, healthy politics, ought to be to bring people together. Not necessarily in a complete consensus on policy, but at least in a consensus on the way in which it's been done, in a feeling that everybody has had an adequate chance, and if it hasn't worked this time, you could have another go later. There must be a sense of legitimacy, and that's the real risk, and that's what we risk losing, and that's what we have lost, I think, to some extent. And that's why I said at the beginning that I think there is a decay in at least some of our democracies. And then finally, because we're coming to the end,
I think it would
maybe
be a good idea.
And so finally, I'll tell you what my solutions are for the UK, because my solutions are institutional. I agree with you that there
are these solutions any good outside the UK?
Probably, yes. Probably they work everywhere. I agree that there are massive policy things that need to be done as well over a long period of time. And I agree that I don't think the term social democracy is a stupid term, because I think the way that social institutions work is a part of the democratic question. So my solution, at any rate, starting with the UK, is you need a political system which is more competitive, in the sense that if you put the British political system in front of the Competition Commission, DG Competition, they would tell you it was highly uncompetitive. It's a system owned by the parties, run by the parties, for the parties, and it fails every competitivity test. And you need to, in Britain, you do that by, you ought to make it easier for new entrants to come in. And consequently, you need to change the voting system. You need to make it more fluid. Society changes so quickly, you need to be able to have new political parties and that kind of thing. And then secondly, because I fear the arrival of the political class, which is such an easy target for the populists, and indeed, I fear the kind of dominance of a political class, that my solution is to have the House of Lords, which is a wonderful body, but unfortunately has very little real power because it's got no legitimacy. So my solution is to choose the House of Lords by lottery, so that you have, so that you have one house which represents, you have two houses which are representative, one because it's been elected, and the other because it's a representative sample of the people. Now, there are lots of problems about that, and you have to work out how to do it. But you have one house which is the ordinary people. And that's a good way of preventing the system being taken over by the political class. Now, those happen to be my ideas this evening for how to solve this important problem. And I don't know anybody who supports them.
I can think of so many ways to game that system. Constance, do you want to round up how to save democracy?
Yes, I agree that a lot of the points made in the last round of questions were really good ones. And it seems to me that surely what we are looking at, what we're attempting to achieve and to maintain, is decent societies. We want institutions, authorities, processes that help us live together in a decent society, that does not mistreat, is not cruel, does not exclude permanently fellow citizens. And to that end, I think, and I'm just going to repeat myself here, I apologize, I think we need to examine the architecture that we have. And in Europe, that will be the architecture of the nation state. And wait, I'm coming to that, Robert. It begins with the architecture of the nation state, where I think we have to ask ourselves, how is power distributed vertically between the federal level or the central level and the periphery and municipalities and states? Is separation and balance of powers working? Is there a party system that is the transmitter belt and functions as a genuine transmitter belt that guarantees political pluralism between the representatives and the represented? And indeed, and I think that if you, I still believe, and I think many of us Europeans believe, that the nation state remains the organic, unique unit of accountability, transparency, and control. But at the same time, we are, at least on the continent, so deeply integrated with each other that we have come to understand that we need European approaches to some problems that transcend our borders. And so the additional layer that we need to fix is how much Europe do we need to be able to solve these common problems together without having to reinvent the wheel all at the same time, while not undermining the nation state. Yeah? That in the abstract are the problems that we'd have to deal with. I don't think this is rocket science. I don't think that we need a new system. But the problem that it is true, of course, that modern communications technology provides the populists and the authoritarians with a possibility of, as it were, having a daily referendum on representative democracy and thereby challenging its legitimacy and undermining it.
When you say a daily referendum, do you mean actual voting on issues, on questions of governance?
No, but it comes down to something very like that. It is an expression of opinion, or it is an expression of a lack of consensus, and nobody uses that more exquisitely and more powerfully than the President of the United States currently.
And in fact, populists in general are more adept at using that, I would say, than the people we might call liberal politicians. They're more willing to tap into that daily sentiment. So maybe the point is that liberals need to, or whatever we call them, progressives, I don't know, need to be better at that themselves.
Exactly. I mean, look, we're not going to turn back the clock of technology. Yeah? We're not going to change this. But what I profoundly believe is that we need to figure out how to make the institutions of representative democracy more resilient against these new fragmenting forces. But that's doable. That's not impossible at all.
Well, like my colleagues on the panel, I very much enjoyed, Sir, your comments from Turkey, which is how I open my own comments about this fragmentation is global. The post-democratic order is real, it's empirically verified, and it abounds. And the same point, I think, Sir, that you made, that essentially our governing class has been captured by one value set, and every other value set is policed out. This is where we are. And the remarks, what's really awful is the epistemology, if you forgive me using such a term, of the modern day doesn't allow for consensus. The internet is always self-confirming and polarizing. You come out with an opinion on the internet, you search for those who already share your opinion and have a more extreme version of it. What we've lost from our polity is any form of contestment that we enjoy and consensus building that we support. And that's part of what makes everything so dangerous. I repeat again the point I made, because I think it's true, that the reason that we're seeing democracy fragmented and declining is it's not dealing with the problems that it was meant to deal with. That we came up with democracy as a means of limiting absolute power, of distributing property and goods, of creating consensus and stability. And it's exactly that we're failing to do and deliver. So the question is what can democracies do? There's really wonderful work by Mark Maswitz, who's a great British historian, who wrote when he was at Sussex, called Dark Continent. And in that, he tried to ask why, during the Second World War, did every European democracy fail and was heading towards either extreme communism or fascism, and why didn't the United Kingdom? And part of the answer, I think, is Britain has institutions that command support that are beyond politics, most specifically the monarchy. These are custodians of the national good that are not susceptible to politics, i.e. they are non-partisan, and they embody the national good. And in some sense, they're the ultimate authority. It's very interesting that Britain's armed forces swear loyalty not to Parliament, but to the monarch. And I always think it's better to be a subject than a citizen for exactly this reason. Because if you can because what modern democracy lacks is a hierarchical principle. It only has a horizontal principle. It lacks a hierarchical principle that tells you how to do distributed justice, how to decide between rights. So, for instance, the problem with rights is they don't tell you what's right. They don't tell you how to decide between competing rights. And what always happens is the elite that's in charge selects its own version. So we need something substantive that's beyond politics that embodies the good of that nation. And in the UK, I think in part it's the monarchy, it's other institutions like the BBC, but I think every nation will have something that holds it together. That if it's not yet institutionalized, because it's a relentless, simplistic French version of democracy, it needs to be created. Unless you can create a hierarchical principle that is in harmony with a democratic principle, you're in trouble.
Carl. The last word falls to you.
Well, a couple of points, but I mean, the next time I see the King of Sweden, I'm going to tell him that monarchy is the solution.
8 out of 10 of the UN's most happy countries are
I will be
constitutional
mightily
monarchies.
pleased. But as a recipe for the future, I think it is a slightly uphill battle on that one. But anyhow, it's a good point. A couple of other points. On technology and the impact of that, I'm all in favor of digitalization and modern and social media, but don't exaggerate it. The Daily Mail has been around for a long time. So fake news is not a new phenomenon. And the most significant instrument of Donald Trump wasn't Twitter or Facebook, it was television. I saw the other day someone who was on the board of the CBS, and referred to sort of the CEO of CBS sitting at the board meeting that he knew that Donald Trump was very bad for America, but was fabulous for the ratings of CBS. Because they were broadcasting live all of his speeches, because they were so outrageous that people looked at them. They were emotionally engaging, and television emotionally engages in a way that social media, as of yet, doesn't. That being said, I'm a big fan of social media and think it's very important. Second point, I think Andre made the point about sort of populism and democracy, which I agree with, and makes me rather uncomfortable with phrasing the entire debate as just populism. It's a much wider debate. Third point, Trump and Brexit were a fairly specific phenomena, I would argue. The real debate about populism, if you should have it, must take in the two prime examples of really destructive populism in the more or less modern age, and that's Argentina and Venezuela. Those are the two countries that have been destroyed by populism, totally destroyed by populism, I would argue, their economies. And why is that the case? Well, because they didn't have sufficiently strong institutions to withstand that particular wave that was there. And what is then the institutions that we need? We need representative rather than direct democracy. Switzerland being the exception. They've learned to live with direct democracy. But solid representative democracy, good thing. Constitutional order where the constitution is thoroughly respected with the separation of powers. Rule of law. Those things. If we have those solid in our societies, we can withstand waves of even populism in a way that Argentina and Venezuela could. Final point. I happen to be a believer, as I think I pointed out, in the liberal order, be that of our domestic societies or be that of the world. But we should not underestimate the transformation that we are now entering into. We talk about sort of industrial workers that are sort of lost out and whatever. They're going to be more of that. Once upon a time, at the beginning of the industrial age, we probably had 60–70% of our population in agriculture. We now have, I don't know the Swedish figure, but if I say 1%, I'm probably in the sort of roughly the right bracket. I would argue that within a generation, industrial production or industrial society will go roughly the way of agricultural society with automatization. So we have vast social and economic changes ahead of us that needs to be accommodated within a liberal order. I think it's doable, but we need to redefine the liberal order of our societies and of the world to the digital age that we are just about to enter. That is the big task, and that can only be done by institutions and values, and to return to my main point, by ideological battles where we, whoever we are ready to stand up and fight for the ideas that we know are right and not just be diluted into technocratic managers that lose the confidence of our peoples.
Thank you. So I have to say that, ending on that note, I'm not as optimistic as Constanze about when you said that this is not rocket science, because I think for me this panel, in a sense, is we're like a microcosm of a society living with a populist problem, which is although everybody here has very close shared values, we're clearly coming from quite different places on what the root cause, or not the root, we all agree there are many causes, but what is the area that each of you has focused on? I mean, you've talked about ideology, you've talked about values, and you've talked about structural issues and electoral systems. But this feels to me like what's called a wicked problem. It's a problem that has very, very many moving, interconnected parts. All of them have to be solved in some sense to overcome this difficulty. As Carl was pointing out, that very large economic changes are going to affect this in the future. And it seems to me that part of the problem is that if we're going to affect the kinds of, for instance, structural changes or changes to the political system that you're talking about, we need a consensus about what those changes are trying to achieve, and it's the lack of that consensus that has brought us to this problem in the first place. So I find a bit of a chicken and an egg problem as well. So not to end it on a pessimistic note, but I'm ending on a pessimistic note. Thank you very much indeed.
Actually,